Shortly before dawn on August the 12th, 1983, in Aldershot, Hampshire, England, 77-year-old Alfred Burtoo was quietly fishing on the Basingstoke Canal. The canal winds through Aldershot, a town known as the home of the British Army because of its many military establishments. On that night, the weather forecast predicted ideal conditions for fishing, prompting Alfred to leave his North Town home at 12:15 a.m, accompanied by his dog Tiny. Alfred was a pensioner who had served in the Queen's Royal Regiment in 1924 and the Hampshire Regiment during World War II, and had lived an adventurous life. He had worked as a farmer and gardener, and during his time in the Canadian outback had hunted bear and wolves. Known locally as an historian, he had no prior interest in UFOs or extraterrestrial phenomena, and before this night he had never read any books or magazines on the subject. After reaching Government Road, Alfred encountered a Ministry of Defence policeman on patrol. They exchanged brief pleasantries before he continued his journey to his favourite fishing spot about 120 yards north of Gasworks Bridge. Alfred secured his dog Tiny by taking the bottom joint of his fishing umbrella, sticking it into the ground and tethering the dog to it. He cast his line into the canal waters and placed his rod on a rest. He then heard the gong at Buller Barracks strike 1 o'clock. About 50 minutes later, Alfred decided to pour himself a cup of tea from his thermos flask. It was at this moment that the ordinary fishing trip took an extraordinary turn, when a vivid light appeared descending from the sky over North Town. Alfred watched it in amazement as it moved in a falling leaf motion over the nearby Aldershot to London railway line. The light briefly blacked out for a few seconds before re-illuminating and appearing to land on the embankment on the other side of Gasworks Bridge. "I thought, well, that can't be an aeroplane," Alfred Burtoo later recalled. "It's too low because it was at about 300 feet. He could hear a strange whining noise that reminded him of an electric generator. Trying to maintain his composure, Alfred lit a cigarette while keeping a watchful eye on the landing area. Suddenly his dog began to growl furiously. Even in the darkness, Alfred could make out 2 small statured figures approaching along the towpath. He commanded Tiny to be quiet, and the obedient dog fell silent. The fisherman later remarked, "I wasn't afraid, I was more curious than anything." As the figures drew near, Alfred could see them clearly. Standing no more than 5 feet in front of him were 2 small humanoid beings, each approximately 4 feet tall. "They just stopped and looked at me, and I did the same," he reported. The beings were dressed from head to foot in pale green coveralls that appeared to be made of a plastic-like material. There were no visible buttons or fasteners. They wore helmets of the same colour with black visors that obscured their faces. One of the beings beckoned him with its right forearm, turning away while continuing to wave its arm. Taking this as an invitation to follow, Alfred fell in behind the being, with the second being following behind him. The 3 formed a line and walked along the towpath until they reached the railings by the canal bridge. Alfred observed something peculiar. The being in front of him appeared to pass through the railings like a ghost, while he himself had to climb over the top. They crossed Government Road and returned to the canal footpath. After rounding a left-hand turn in the pathway, he saw something that took his breath away. "Christ, what the hell is that?" he thought to himself, as he gazed upon a large disc-shaped object, approximately 40 to 45 feet across. It stood partly on the towpath, with between 10 to 15 feet of it jutting out over the embankment. As it drew closer, he could see that the craft had steps leading up to it. The steps were offline to the towpath, requiring them to walk onto the grass to ascend them. Around the hull there appeared to be portals, and the vehicle rested on 2 ski-type runners. The exterior reminded him of polished aluminium. Following the lead being, Alfred climbed the steps into the craft. The doorway had no sharp corners. Everything was rounded. Once inside, he found himself in what he described as an octagonal room with black walls, floor and ceiling that appeared to be made of unfinished metal. in contrast to the craft's exterior. There were no visible nuts, bolts or seams. Everything had seamless, moulded appearance. The ceiling was low, forcing him to stoop. The floor seemed to be covered with a soft material, as he couldn't hear his own footsteps. The lighting was generally dim, and didn't appear to come from any specific source. The temperature inside was slightly warmer than outside, approximately 65 degrees Fahrenheit or 18 degrees Celsius. The being that had led the way crossed the room, and Alfred heard what sounded like a sliding door opening and closing. The entity that had been following him stood between him and the door, though he couldn't determine if this was to prevent him from leaving. Most intriguing to Alfred was a shaft that rose from the floor to the ceiling, approximately 4 feet in circumference. On the right-hand side of this shaft was a Z-shaped handle. Standing on either side were 2 more humanoid figures, similar to those that had escorted him along the towpath. He also noticed a faint smell in the air, which he likened to decaying meat. For more than 10 minutes, Alfred stood absorbing every detail of this otherworldly environment. Suddenly, a voice emanated from somewhere in the room. "Come and stand under the amber light," it instructed. Alfred couldn't initially see any amber light until he took a step to the right. Then he spotted it on the wall, just under the ceiling. He stood there for about 5 minutes before the voice addressed him again. "What is your age?" the voice inquired. It had a distinctive sing-song quality, with an accent that Alfred described as sounding like a mixture of Chinese and Russian. He replied truthfully that he would be 78 on his next birthday. After a pause, the voice instructed him to turn around, which he did, now facing the wall. After approximately 5 more minutes, the voice delivered its curious verdict. "You can go. You are too old and infirm for our purpose." Without protest, Alfred departed the craft. While walking down the steps, he used the handrail and noticed that it had 2 joints in it, leading him to conclude it was telescopic. He proceeded along the towpath until he was about halfway between the object and the canal bridge. Stopping to look back, he noticed the dome of the craft resembled an oversized chimney cowl and was revolving in an anti-clockwise direction. He then returned to where he had left his dog and his fishing tackle. "The first thing I did when I got there was to pick up my cold cup of tea and drink it," he later recalled with remarkable composure. It was then that he heard the whining noise again, like an electric generator starting up. The craft lifted off, and the bright lights came on once more. The illumination was so intense that Alfred could see his fishing float in the water 6 feet away from the opposite bank of the canal. He could even make out the thin iron bars on the canal bridge. The object took off at tremendous speed, flying over the military cemetery to the west. A short time later, Alfred saw the light passing over the Hog's Back area before disappearing from sight. It was approximately 2 a.m. Rather than fleeing the scene or reporting his extraordinary experience immediately, he simply settled down to wait for dawn, which came at 3:30 a.m. He then resumed fishing, as if determined not to let his close encounter disrupt his plans. When later asked about his calm reaction, he simply stated, "What did I have to fear? I'm 78 now and haven't got much to lose." At 10 a.m, 2 Ministry of Defence mounted policemen rode up to him. "Any luck, mate?" one of them asked. Alfred replied matter-of-factly, "Yes, I've had 3 roach, 5 rudd, and a tench of 2.5 pounds, and lost a big carp, which took me into the weeds." He then proceeded to tell the officers about the UFO he had witnessed. One of them responded, "Yes, I dare say you did see a UFO. I expect they were checking on our military installations." Whether this was a sincere acknowledgement or a dismissive comment remains unclear. The conversation was cut short when a man from the lockyard approached and informed the policeman that horses were not permitted on the towpath. Alfred continued fishing until 12:30 p.m, finally returning home at 1 p.m. His wife Marjorie and a friend immediately noticed that something about him seemed different. Alfred told them that he'd seen a UFO, but initially didn't dare mention that it had been taken aboard the craft. 2 days later, he returned to the landing site and observed that the foliage where the UFO had stood was flattened and in disarray. However, no photographs or soil samples were taken, as he feared ridicule regardless of what evidence he might produce. Remarkably, unlike many reported close encounters, Alfred Burtoo did not experience common after effects such as temporary paralysis, nausea, diarrhea, or time lapse. However, as his wife and friend verified, his manner was noticeably different following the encounter. Marjorie also observed that he wasn't eating much, resulting in weight loss for a period of time. Despite his reluctance to seek publicity, Alfred's story eventually reached local UFO investigator Omar Fowler, a chairman of the Surrey Investigation Group on Aerial Phenomena. Although initially sceptical, Fowler became convinced of Alfred's sincerity after thorough investigation. "I was very sceptical about his story when I went to interview him," Fowler admitted, "but he came out with things he couldn't possibly have known about unless he'd been studying UFOs for years." Fowler later declared, "This is really an exciting case. I believe it to be genuine. I've been investigating UFO sightings for 16 years, and this is the most sensational thing that's ever happened." He also observed, "If the witness was not lying, and I, for one, am convinced he was not, we are presented with an important and highly detailed account which may teach us a great deal about the UFO phenomenon." Timothy Good, another prominent UFO researcher who had lectured on the subject at universities throughout England and before a British government commission, also took an interest in the case. Good interviewed Alfred Burtoo more than 12 times over several months, subjecting him to detailed questioning. Burtoo's account remained consistent in every detail. Good also investigated Burtoo's background thoroughly. "I'm convinced this man is telling the truth," Good declared. "There is no doubt in my mind that he was taken aboard an alien craft." Alfred Burtoo had nothing to gain from fabricating such a story. He received no financial compensation and did not actively seek publicity. Those who knew him described him as a genuine, honest and responsible person who had fought in World War II. As one friend who used to go fishing with him later confirmed, Alfred was a really nice man and certainly not given to making stories up. Alfred's wife Marjorie vehemently denied that her husband had lied. "What Alf told you was the absolute truth," she insisted. "My friend who was with me when Alf came home can verify what he said. He looked absolutely shaken, and he told both of us about the experience that he'd had with the UFO." Despite the being's abrupt dismissal aboard the craft, Alfred later declared his nocturnal adventures to have been the greatest experience of my life. Interestingly, Alfred Burtoo is not alone in reportedly failing an alien examination. American abductee Carl Higdon was allegedly rejected for a hybrid breeding program after captors discovered his vasectomy. The Ministry of Defence appeared uninterested in the case, stating, "The majority of reports received here are often weeks old, and we simply cannot devote public funds to the detailed investigation of such sightings when no threat to national defence has been demonstrated." Alfred Burtoo passed away on August 31st, 1986, but his story lives on. With almost religious regularity, local newspapers publish abbreviated accounts of Burtoo's encounter each year to coincide with the anniversary of the incident. Unfortunately, these retellings often trivialise the case, portraying the witness in a negative light. In the years following Burtoo's death, UFO researcher Hilary Porter has periodically monitored the encounter site, walking the canal path and exploring the surrounding area. Porter has noted that the area has become increasingly restricted, with special military presence in many locations, including SAS soldiers dressed in black and fully armed. This heightened security began long before any major security concerns of the early 2000s, raising questions about what authorities might be concealing. In December 2006, Porter took digital photographs at the alleged landing site and discovered a peculiar anomaly in one of the images. A strange object that wasn't visible to the naked eye when the picture was taken, nor when Porter returned to check the location minutes later. Under magnification, the object appeared to be manifesting or shape-shifting, about to expand in size. The case of Alfred Burtoo presents investigators with a stark choice. Either the elderly fisherman fabricated an elaborate hoax for no apparent gain, or he genuinely experienced something extraordinary on that August night in 1983. As Fowler observed, we are presented with an important and highly detailed account which may teach us a great deal about the UFO phenomenon. What makes this case particularly compelling is its lack of sensationalism. There was no abduction in the traditional sense, no medical experimentation, no missing time. Instead, there was a curious interaction followed by dismissal for being too old and infirm. It is perhaps this very ordinariness, combined with Burton's matter-of-fact reaction, that lends the account its credibility. The Basingstoke Canal continues to flow through Aldershot, past the spot where, on August night in 1983, an elderly fisherman claimed to have stepped aboard a craft not of this world. Whether you believe Alfred Burtoo's story or not, it stands as one of the most detailed and intriguing close encounter cases in British UFO history, revealing how extraordinary encounters can happen to the most ordinary people in the most mundane of circumstances.